I'm going to walk into the conference room, and they already know I'm about to be fired. I can see it in the way my supervisor's jaw is clenched, the way he won't make eye contact, the way his manicured hand is gripping the edge of the glass table like it's the only solid thing keeping him connected to reality. Nobody has told me yet that my career is ending today, but I can taste it. The air in this room smells like ambition and cruelty, and I've learned to recognize that combination because I've been breathing it for 6 years. My name is Victoria. I'm 31 years old, and I'm about to teach the most powerful people in Atlanta a very expensive lesson about what happens when you mistake quiet competence for weakness. Before I tell you what happened next, I need you to understand something about corporate America that nobody wants to admit out loud. The person doing the actual work is never the person getting the actual credit. I spent 6 years making a supervisor look like a genius. I spent 6 years answering frantic phone calls at 2 in the morning when our supply chain fractured. I spent 6 years skipping family time and personal relationships to fix his mistakes before the board of directors noticed. And every single time I solved a catastrophic problem, he presented the solution to executive leadership as his own personal innovation. He stood in front of investors and explained my algorithms like they were his brilliant ideas. He took promotion after promotion, bonus after bonus, climbing the ladder on my back, while I stayed trapped in middle management. That's the system I was suffocating inside. But here's what he didn't know. I wasn't just quietly accepting my fate, I was building my exit strategy. Let me go back. 2 weeks before this termination meeting, I received an email that changed everything. I was sitting at my desk on a Tuesday evening. Everyone else had gone home hours earlier, which was typical for me when my director of operations walked past my cubicle and casually mentioned that our quarterly revenue projections were down 23%. He didn't seem worried. He seemed embarrassed, like he'd personally disappointed someone important. The truth was far worse than a temporary revenue dip. Our supply chain logistics were completely outdated. We were hemorrhaging operational efficiency. The automated routing systems my supervisor had inherited from his predecessor were barely functioning anymore. We needed a complete technological overhaul, and we needed it immediately. So I did what I'd been doing for 6 years. I stayed late, I analyzed the problem, I developed a solution. Except this time, I didn't integrate my solution into the company infrastructure for my supervisor to steal and claim. This time, I built it separately. I spent 4 years working nights and weekends, writing sophisticated software that could predict shipping disruptions before they happened, route freight containers across continents with minimum inefficiency, and optimize warehouse inventory in real time. I built it on my own infrastructure, with my own servers, completely hidden from my employer's network. I called it Meridian Systems, and I founded a shell corporation to house it. I filed the paperwork through a business attorney who kept my identity confidential. When the software was finished, when every algorithm was perfect and every integration protocol was flawless, I installed it secretly into our company's aging infrastructure. My supervisor never questioned it. He saw the quarterly revenue suddenly start climbing. He saw our shipping times compress by 40%. He saw customer satisfaction scores spike across every region. He took full credit. He walked into board meetings and explained how he'd personally architected this brilliant operational transformation. Nobody questioned him because the numbers were undeniable. They were legitimate. He just didn't realize he was standing on top of an empire that belonged to someone else entirely. The moment I understood I had created something powerful, something independent, something that couldn't be taken away from me, I experienced a feeling I'd never known before. It was freedom. Not financial freedom, not yet. It was psychological freedom. I had leverage now. I had insurance. If this job ever became unbearable, I had an exit route that my supervisor couldn't control. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly I would need to use it. The termination meeting happened on a Monday morning, exactly 36 hours ago. I remember walking from my desk toward the conference room and seeing my supervisor standing inside, flanked by our human resources director, Margaret, a woman who smiled like a shark and whose entire career was built on executing the firing decisions made by powerful men. I walked inside and closed the glass door. The room felt like a coffin. Margaret opened a folder with theatrical slowness and informed me that they had discovered evidence of my outside business activities. They had somehow found out that I was running my own company during company time. She stated it like it was a criminal accusation, like I'd been embezzling money or selling trade secrets. My supervisor leaned back in his chair, and I watched a smile spread across his face. That smile told me everything I needed to know about what was really happening. This wasn't about corporate policy or ethics. This was about power. He'd realized that my outside work might be valuable, and he'd made a decision. If he fired me, if he fired the person who actually understood how the software worked, then technically the company would own it by default. All those algorithms, all that code, all that intellectual property would belong to Vanguard Logistics. He would be able to present it to the board as his accomplishment, sell it to competitors, monetize it, or simply prevent me from ever using it again. He thought he was executing a brilliant corporate assassination. What he didn't know was that I'd anticipated this exact scenario. I'd built my infrastructure with military-grade security protocols. My software was programmed to recognize only my personal administrative credentials. If anyone without my direct authorization ever tried to access the core systems, the software would interpret it as a hostile takeover and would automatically initiate a complete security lockdown. That lockdown would begin immediately and would take approximately 36 hours to fully complete. I didn't argue with them. I didn't defend myself. I just smiled and asked my supervisor if he was entirely sure this was the route he wanted to take. I told him that my software was extremely delicate and that it required my daily intervention to function properly. He actually scoffed at me. He told me I was flattering myself, that he had an entire IT department, that I was utterly replaceable. He demanded that I write down my administrative passwords. I picked up a pen from the table, looked directly into his eyes, and very calmly refused. Then I signed the termination papers, removed my employee badge, and stood up to leave. Security walked me out of the building at 9:47 a.m. I had exactly 5 minutes to collect my personal items. I didn't touch my computer. I didn't need to. I didn't need to delete files or sabotage anything because I'd already arranged the entire destruction. I walked out through the lobby in complete silence. Nobody looked at me. My coworkers were too afraid of the supervisor to even acknowledge that I was being removed. I placed a small cardboard box containing 3 framed photographs and my favorite coffee mug into my sedan and sat in the parking lot for exactly 90 seconds. That's when I felt my phone vibrate. I watched my corporate email account sync one final time, then gray out completely, the access protocols disconnected. The company had locked me out of the Vanguard network with stunning efficiency. What they didn't realize was that the moment they terminated my employee access and deleted my administrative account from their Active Directory, they triggered the exact mechanism that would destroy everything. My software detected the hostile deletion like an immune system detecting a virus. It interpreted the aggressive removal of my credentials as a security breach. The automated failsafe I'd embedded deep in the core code activated instantly. A controlled decoupling sequence began. It wasn't immediate. I designed it that way deliberately. An abrupt, complete system shutdown would trigger external failsafes that might alert competitors or banking partners that something was catastrophically wrong. Instead, my software initiated a slow, methodical unbinding. Over the next 36 hours, every data node, every operational pathway, every connection between Vanguard servers and Meridian systems would gradually, inexorably disconnect. The countdown had officially begun. 55 hours later, I was sitting in my penthouse on Peachtree Street, watching the downtown Atlanta skyline glow under afternoon sun, when my family ambushed me. I hadn't even told them I was fired because I knew how they'd react, and I was absolutely correct. My father, Douglas, had played golf that morning with the father of my supervisor. The two men had belonged to the same country club for 20 years. My supervisor had apparently called his father in a panic, and my father had called me approximately 47 times, leaving increasingly agitated voicemails. Finally, he'd simply driven to my penthouse building without warning, and brought my mother and my sister along to witness my humiliation. I let them up because I was curious to see exactly how far they would go. My mother rushed toward me with her arms open like I'd just returned from war. "Victoria, sweetheart, we know you're going through something difficult," she said, her voice trembling with manufactured concern. "We thought we'd support you by taking you out for dinner at Morrell's. Celebrate our anniversary and remind you that family is what matters most." I nearly laughed. My parents' anniversary dinner had been scheduled for months. This sudden support had nothing to do with me and everything to do with damage control. My father was concerned about how my termination might reflect on his business reputation. My sister, Amber, was simply interested in drama. I arrived at the restaurant, expecting a brief, uncomfortable meal. I was not prepared for what actually happened. My father waited exactly 4 minutes before the hostess seated us, before unleashing an aggressive tirade that made other diners stare at our table. He leaned across the white tablecloth and informed me that I'd humiliated our entire family in front of his business associates. He demanded I explain why I'd been engaged in unauthorized side business activities during company time. He told me I was irresponsible. He told me I was throwing away opportunity. He told me I needed to get on my knees tomorrow morning and beg my supervisor for my job back, and if I refused, he would legally dissolve my portion of my grandfather's trust fund. That's when my sister decided to contribute. She rolled her eyes and explained that my situation was pathetic. She suggested I was simply bad at corporate work, that maybe I should have focused on being a better employee instead of playing with internet hobbies. My mother joined in, explaining that they'd sacrificed so much to raise me, and this was how I repaid them by embarrassing them publicly. None of them asked if I was okay. None of them asked what had actually happened. They simply assumed I was the problem, and they were there to make me understand how my failure affected them. I listened to them for approximately 8 minutes before standing up from the table. I told them very clearly that I would not be returning to my supervisor to beg. I told them that my internet hobby was actually a multi-million-dollar software company that I'd built entirely on my own. I told them that their disappointment in me meant absolutely nothing anymore because I'd stopped requiring their validation years ago. Then I placed a $50 bill on the table covering only my salad and water and walked out of the restaurant. From the parking lot, I could hear my father screaming that I needed to come back, that I was ruining everything, that I was selfish and ungrateful. I didn't look back. What was happening at Vanguard in that exact moment was far more interesting than anything my family could possibly do. The 6-hour countdown had reached its climax. Inside the corporate headquarters, the entire supply chain network was experiencing complete operational collapse. 300 transport trucks were stranded at the port of Charleston with no dispatch coordinates. 40 shipping vessels were floating off the coast with no docking instructions. The automated routing software that managed warehouse inventory had gone completely dark. Regional managers were screaming into their radios trying to coordinate shipments, using paper manifests and outdated protocols from a decade ago. Thousands of perishable goods were spoiling in cargo containers because the temperature control systems had disconnected. My supervisor was in his corner office, hyperventilating and sweating through his expensive suit. He tried calling the Meridian Systems support hotline repeatedly. Each time he reached our automated system, which informed him that his account was temporarily restricted due to security protocols. He didn't understand that there was no override. There was no support team that could restore his access. The only person on Earth who could reactivate his connection was me, and I had no intention of answering his calls. By Wednesday morning, the board of directors had arrived from out of state. The chairman flew in on his private jet from Chicago. He was a brutal businessman in his late 60s who had spent 4 decades dismantling inefficient corporations. He didn't care about my supervisor's family connections or country club status. He only cared that his company was hemorrhaging millions of dollars every single hour. An emergency closed-door meeting was called. My supervisor was forced to explain what had happened. He initially tried to spin it as a malicious cyber attack orchestrated by a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge. He actually named me specifically and demanded the board authorize criminal charges against me. The chairman wasn't convinced. The board had hired a forensic auditing firm, and that firm had traced the exact digital architecture. This wasn't a crude virus or a hack. This was a sophisticated, deliberate disconnection initiated by the software vendor's own security protocols. The Meridian Systems contract was pulled up. They reviewed it carefully and found language they'd previously overlooked. The software was programmed to recognize only specific administrative credentials. If those credentials were revoked, the system would interpret it as a hostile threat and would automatically implement a defensive lockdown to protect the company's proprietary intellectual property. Meridian Systems owned the software. Vanguard was simply leasing it. By firing me, by deleting my credentials, my supervisor had triggered the exact legal consequence outlined in the vendor agreement. He'd essentially unplugged the entire company with his own hands. The chairman looked directly at my supervisor and asked a single question. Where is the chief executive officer of Meridian Systems? My supervisor's face went white. He didn't know. He'd never bothered to find out who actually owned the company that was keeping his supply chain alive. That's when the chairman instructed everyone to call Meridian Systems and demand an immediate meeting with their founder. That call was placed at 10:47 a.m. on Wednesday morning. I was sitting in my office on the 23rd floor of the Meridian Tower when the Vanguard board chairman requested my immediate presence. He made the request through our corporate legal department, which meant it had the weight of desperation behind it. I had no intention of making it easy. I asked our legal counsel to inform the Vanguard board that I would meet with them in person, but only if they agreed to my specific terms. I told them I wanted Meridian Systems to have complete control over the meeting location, and I wanted all board members present when I arrived. I also wanted my supervisor physically present in the room so he could witness what was about to happen. Then I hung up the phone and got ready. I changed into a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than my old Vanguard annual salary. I had my hair done. I drove myself to the Vanguard headquarters in downtown Atlanta, parked in the executive lot, and walked through the front entrance like I owned the building. The security guard at the front desk recognized me instantly. He looked confused. I'd been fired 2 days ago, and I definitely wasn't supposed to be inside this building. I smiled at him, informed him I had a 1 p.m. meeting with the board chairman, and walked directly to the executive elevator before he could call for backup. The elevator rose smoothly. I watched the floor numbers climb. 15, 20, 25. The doors opened onto the executive level, and the atmosphere was absolutely suffocating. I could feel the panic radiating from every cubicle. The supply chain disaster was now public knowledge. International news outlets were already covering the story. Vanguard Logistics was being described as operationally crippled. The stock price was plummeting. The elevator doors to the executive boardroom were heavy oak and glass. I could see through the glass into the massive conference room where the chairman was sitting at the head of a mahogany table. My supervisor was standing near the digital projector, his face already pale with anticipation. He thought I was coming to negotiate, to plead my case, to desperate for my job back. He had absolutely no idea what was about to happen. I didn't knock. I opened the heavy glass doors and stepped directly into the room. The moment my supervisor saw me, his entire face contorted into absolute confusion. He started to say something. I could see his mouth forming words, but then he stopped. I was not the desperate fired employee he'd removed from the building. I was something else entirely. I was wearing designer clothing. I was moving with absolute confidence. I was holding my own briefcase. I was walking toward the table like I belonged there. The chairman stood up slowly. He was a predator, and he recognized another predator when he saw one. He looked at my suit, my posture, my face, and something shifted in his expression. He knew, before I'd said a single word, that this was not going to go the way his vice president had promised. I opened my briefcase and placed a single heavy business card directly onto the mahogany table. The card had my name, Victoria Marsh, and underneath it, Founder and Chief Executive Officer, Meridian Systems. The color drained from my supervisor's face so completely that he looked like a corpse. I watched his brain try to process what was happening. The gentle realization spread across his features like a slow, poisonous fog. The woman he'd just fired 2 days ago wasn't a disgruntled employee. She was the person who owned the company that had just destroyed his entire corporation. The chairman leaned back in his chair and let out a long, low laugh. He folded his hands and looked directly at me. "Please," he said, "sit down and tell us exactly how much this is going to cost us." I sat at the opposite end of the table from him, facing my supervisor across the polished wood. The distance between us felt symbolic. We were no longer colleagues. We were opponents. I began by explaining the facts very clearly. 2 years ago, Meridian Systems had installed our proprietary software into Vanguard's infrastructure. That software was protected by a licensing agreement that specified only one condition. If the lead administrative liaison was terminated without just cause, the software would automatically disconnect. My supervisor had terminated me yesterday morning. Therefore, Meridian Systems had no legal obligation to restore connectivity. I watched his face crumble as he understood what I was saying. He tried to interrupt, to argue that it was a misunderstanding, but I held up my hand. I explained that I was willing to restore connectivity, but only under specific terms. First, I wanted a $10 million emergency restoration fee wired to my corporate account by 3 p.m. Second, I wanted a new 5-year licensing agreement that tripled the annual vendor fees. Third, I wanted my supervisor and the HR director fired immediately, with no severance packages and no vested stock options. The board members began whispering frantically to each other. A woman in a navy suit actually slammed her hand on the table and told me this was extortion. I stared at her very calmly and asked if she was currently losing $1 million every 12 hours. She fell silent. The chairman looked at me with what I can only describe as genuine respect. He stood up and walked toward a phone mounted on the wall. Without hesitation, he instructed the lead corporate attorney to draft a new agreement incorporating my terms. He turned to my supervisor and said 5 words: "You're terminated, effective immediately." My supervisor tried to stand up, tried to say something, tried to salvage his position through negotiation or threat. But the chairman held up a single hand. That gesture alone communicated absolute finality. Security officers appeared within seconds. They physically escorted him from the room. I watched his face contort with rage and terror as they grabbed his arms. He'd walked into this boardroom believing he was untouchable. He was leaving as a dismissed liability. The document was drafted and printed within 20 minutes. I reviewed every single line, verified that the financial terms were binding and irreversible, and signed my name with the chairman's fountain pen. The moment my signature was dry, I opened a secure application on my phone and entered my administrative override credentials. The Meridian Systems software reconnected to the Vanguard network instantly. The terminals around the room flickered to life. The red emergency warnings that had been flashing for 36 hours suddenly transformed into green operational confirmation. The digital dashboard showed full connectivity restored. The chairman leaned back in his chair and smiled. He extended his hand for a handshake, which I accepted firmly. "That," he said quietly, "is the most impressive business negotiation I've witnessed in 40 years. That's not hyperbole. That was masterfully executed." I walked out of that boardroom understanding something that my family still hasn't learned. Your worth isn't determined by other people's recognition. Your value isn't established by the people who claim to love you. My family could dismiss me. My supervisor could fire me. The corporate system could try to grind me down. But I'd built something they couldn't take away because I'd never asked their permission in the first place. I walked away from that boardroom with a $40 million contract, a restored reputation in the tech industry, and the absolute knowledge that everyone who'd underestimated me was watching me walk toward success. 6 months later, my supervisor was working a minimum wage sales job, calling companies daily, trying to sell printer toner on commission. My father's real estate firm filed for bankruptcy. My mother was forced to downsize to a modest suburban home. My sister was working retail, paying off fraudulent credit card debt, and I was running one of the most profitable software companies in the Southeast. The lesson here is simple but brutal. Don't mistake someone's patience for weakness. Don't confuse someone's quiet work ethic with a lack of ambition. The most dangerous people are the ones who've been systematically underestimated because they've had time to build something you can't see. If you've ever been in a room where someone looked right through you, where you felt completely invisible to people who held power over you, I want you to know that feeling wasn't weakness. That was preparation. You were learning, you were building, and that's when the real power starts to form. If you've ever experienced a boss who took credit for your work, I need to hear from you in the comments. Drop a number 1. If your own family has ever chosen status over supporting you, drop a number 2. And if you've ever walked away from people who didn't recognize your worth, drop a number 3. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Because right now, someone reading this is in a situation exactly like Victoria's was. You're working for someone who doesn't deserve you. You're surrounded by people who refuse to see your value. And you're building something they don't know about yet. Hit that subscribe button if you believe that your moment is coming, because it absolutely is. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Atlanta to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.